All right, so next up, we're going to move on to conjugated compounds. And so the most simplest form of this we can get is a diene. And a diene, as the name implies, it's two alkenes in a molecule. And depending where they're at, it can give different chemical properties to the compound. So the first type of diene we have is what's known as an allene, or accumulated pi bonds. And so here we have pi bonds right next to each other. And we say that these are not conjugated. We'll see why in a moment here. Next up, we have conjugated. A conjugated diene, like 1,4-butadiene. And so here we have pi bonds separated by one sigma bond. Right, so we've got our two pi bonds here, and in between is a sigma bond, right? And you can imagine drawing resonance structures here. Drawing resonance structures is a big sign that something is conjugated. It doesn't just have to be carbons, though. It can be other types of double bonds. So, for example, you can have an alkene and then a carbonyl. That's also a conjugated system because you have two pi bonds separated by a sigma bond. And then finally, we have isolated dienes or isolated pi bonds. And so in this case, the pi bonds are separated by more than one sigma bond. And so again, here you can't draw any resonance structures. So all of this has to do with whether the pi bonds can interact with one another. So if we take a look at these two structures, right, the accumulated or the allene here, we can see that although you might think you can draw resonance structures with this, you really can't because they're at 90 degrees from one another. Remember that this central carbon is sp hybridization, and so it has two p orbitals at 90 degrees from one another, and so you can't actually have a conjugated system, right? When you do have a conjugated system, although we draw it like this, the real structure has these pi electrons delocalized over the entire molecule, right? Which you can see here in this picture, how all four of these pi bonds are connected to one another. And then finally, we have the isolated system in which we have alkenes that are too far away from one another, and so they cannot interact with one another. So be able to spot the difference between isolated, conjugated, or accumulated pi systems.